So we just had the patch live stream for 1.2. I'll be honest, nothing really excited me too much other than the main story continuation, which I think is going to be pretty sweet. And Kafka, honestly, I'm really interested in this character, and I want to see how exactly her dot team is going to shape out the meta in the game, so to speak. But overall, the reveal was pretty cool, and we're getting a 10 pull for free again, which I think is pretty sweet. Aside from that, the patch didn't really appeal to me other than Kafka, the main story continuation, and this free temple, which is always very exciting. So, with the arrival of Kafka, the team composition she finds herself in should be very interesting. She has a lot of potential to shine with a character like Silver Wolf, who buffs the dot damage for the allies. She doesn't necessarily buff the dot damage, but the dots do more damage with Silver Wolf in the party. Let me explain. A character like Silverwolf is able to lower the defenses and the resistances of the enemy. I say enemy because her abilities only hit one enemy, not multiple. With Silverwolf's elemental skill, she's able to take a weakness from your team and put that weakness onto the enemy. So with Kafka in the party, you probably will be wanting to get the enemy to have lightning weakness. And that lightning weakness in turn on the enemy will thus lower the resistances of the enemy and make Kafka do even more damage, and give Kafka the weakness break effect she would need, which will in turn give her a shock damage over time effect onto the enemy. So with the lower resistances from Silverwolf, your dots will be doing more damage, because dots take full advantage of defenses and resistances of the enemy, and the lower those two things are, the more your damage over time effects will be doing. Silverwolf also lowers the defense of the enemy, which will in turn increase the dot damage even more. The defense shred is pretty huge, because that in itself is good for dot damage in general, because dots cannot ignore defense and don't necessarily do a percentage of the target's max HP. So you take full advantage of being able to shred the defense and lower the resistances of the enemy to have your dots do more damage. Silverwolf, also able to lower the defenses of the enemy even more, is going to allow even more damage from the dots that Kafka provides to do even more damage. And then the lower speed helps a lot with a character that wants to attack all the time. The cool thing about Kafka is that she gets a lot more value with a character like Silverwolf, because Silverwolf is going to be using her basic attack a lot more often. And whenever you use the basic attack on the enemy, Kafka will follow up, do a follow-up attack, and put a shock onto the enemy, which is another damage over time effect. So these two have perfect synergy with one another. Maybe some of you even have Eidolon 2 for your Silverwolf, which will in turn make it to where your Kafka doesn't necessarily need much effect hit rate to land those dot debuffs on the enemy. Now I said before, Silverwolf gets most of her value when you're fighting 1 to 2 enemies. Not very many enemies on the field, but you can still use her in many AoE situations like I do already now. And the cool thing about Silverwolf is whenever you use this character, you're going to be killing enemies really quickly. So you can just cycle from enemy to enemy to enemy and not necessarily have to worry that she doesn't have an AoE defense shred like Pela. You can use Pela if you want, but I just find Silverwolf to be all the better of a debuffer character. Now on top of that, the lower speed Silverwolf does provide is really valuable, because for a character like Kafka that wants to constantly take the turn and constantly lower the enemy's toughness bar and put the weakness break effects on the enemy, giving that shock damage, you're going to get a lot of value with the debuffs Silverwolf provides. Now let's talk about this light cone in the name of the world. This is actually a pretty good light cone for Kafka. The reason why I say that is because you have everything you need for the character. You increase the damage you do to debuffed enemies by a percentage depending on the level of your light cone. And then whenever you use your elemental skill, you will get the effect hit rate increase for your elemental skill, and that is very valuable for a character that wants to land those dots on the enemy. And then your attack is furthermore increased by a percentage. All of this in turn makes Kafka a much more valuable character. The attack increase is very good for damage over time effects because those attacks scale off of attack percentage. The damage increase to debuff enemies is very valuable because that extra bit of damage increase is going to matter because that counts as elemental damage bonuses. And that elemental damage bonus is good for a character like Kafka, and the reason being is because damage over time also scales off of elemental damage bonuses. So all of this damage amplification taken into consideration is very valuable for the 5-star character. And you also do get an increase on the base stats because it is a 5-star light cone. So if you do have this light cone, this will be a very great option for your Kafka. With all that in mind, these two are going to pair really well together. But in a previous video, we did talk about Kafka and how essentially she will buff Himiko. Is she still going to buff Himiko after her changes? Let's talk about it. So, what was supposed to be a character that was going to buff Himiko is still going to buff Himiko, but at a cost. If you are a waifu over meta player, you probably will not mind this, but the character got essentially changed into being a character that is much more self-sufficient, but a overall team enhancer, a team enabler with constellations. She can still perform pretty well with dot-based characters or characters that have dots in their kit, but she's mostly going to be a nice character to use with a character like Serval and Sampo. You can still use her with a character like Himiko, but just know it's going to come at a price. I still believe that those two have very good synergy with one another. Very well good, that doesn't sound correct. Very good synergy with one another. But is of course going to come at a cost. The Eidolon 2 of Kafka now enhances the damage that characters do with their dot effects by a percentage. That part of her kit was in her kit before, but now that part of her kit that was in her kit before is now a part of her constellations. However, the synergy between these two characters is still there because, well, if the enemies have fire weakness, then you can still take advantage of Himiko getting a lot of value there. When you're breaking the enemy's toughness constantly, well, you're going to be getting a lot of dot effects from Himiko, which in turn will be more dot damage on the enemies overall. So Himiko doesn't necessarily need to attack to put the burn effect or the damage over time onto the enemy. Himiko's talent is able to put a dot onto the enemy whenever your Kafka breaks the weakness of the enemy constantly. You're going to be stacking your charges over and over, and that in turn will be a follow-up attack from Himiko, which has a chance to put a dot on the enemies. So with those changes to Kafka, you probably won't get a lot of value out of Himiko. You can still use this character with Kafka, but it's not going to be as good as it was before. With all things taken into consideration, that video is very outdated. But one thing to keep in mind also is that I speak from a very free-to-play perspective. You can still use her with Kafka if you have her Eidolon 2, but it's not going to be good for people that use her with Kafka if they have Eidolon 0. Now I said before, but a character like Asta is really good with Himiko also, but she is a very strong character to use in that dot team, and here's why. You're going to be increasing the speed of your allies, which is very good for a character like Kafka that wants to constantly put the shock effects onto the enemy over and over again. So you're going to be needing a lot of speed for the character. Asta also puts dots into the enemy, which is very good. Maybe you have Eidolon 2 of Kafka, which in turn will make the dot damage do even more. But if you don't have Eidolon 2, you still get value with Kafka because Kafka can detonate all of the dots that the enemy has at that given point. So any dot you get from Asta is going to be a bonus. Asta also increases the attack of all allies. The attack increase matters because for a character like Kafka or any dot-based carry, well, you get a lot of value having that extra attack because your damage over time effects will do even more damage. About damn time, one of my favorite characters gets the spotlight she deserves. But you all understand how strong Asta already is. Now I do understand there is other characters that are on the way that probably will act as a 5-star version of Asta. And when that character comes out, then you probably will find yourself using that character more than Asta in most of your situations. But as it stands for Kafka currently, Asta is going to be a very strong supporter character for that team. Now, if we take a look at the rest of the Nihility roster, Kafka still has potential with all the rest of the Nihility characters. But I think where it stands currently, her best options here is probably going to be Silverwolf and Sampo. Sampo, who we have not talked about yet, is a very interesting character. He buffs the dot damage that the enemy takes, which in turn makes Kafka do even more dot damage. These two work really well together because they act as yin and yang. They both buff one another, even though they are probably not very much well alike. Sampo being able to increase the dot damage taken by the enemy for 2 turns is very valuable, and this affects all enemies, not just one enemy, so Kafka is able to take advantage of the AoE situations with Sampo. Another thing to keep in mind is that it does scale depending on the level of your ultimate, so that's an even bigger dot damage increase. Sampo, who is now more buffed with Kafka, because of the damage over time effects this character also has with his wind shear. Those wind shear damage over time effects you put into the enemy can now be procced by Kafka. Kafka will detonate all of the damage over time effects that the enemies currently have with her ultimate and her elemental skill. The reason why this is very important is because it was only able to proc the shock effects. Now it's all of the damage over time effects from the allies. So if I had to picture a really solid team to use with Kafka, it would be Asta for the team speed buff, and then the attack increase for the whole team as well, and then also being able to put that dot onto the enemy every now and then. Let's just pretend that my Den Hang is Shampoo because I don't currently have the character, but you'll get this character for free at some point, probably in a patch. The reason why I'm saying that is because just trust me, bro. And then pretend my serval was Kafka, even though she looks nothing like her. But these three characters will essentially act as your core team. In most situations, you use the team for the damage over time. And then your last slot can be whatever character you want to be mostly. I think of this as your maybe defensive option if you're running harder content, or maybe your offensive option if you have a ton of speed already with Asta and your Kafka being fast, and you're going to be breaking the weakness of the enemy left and right. So you probably don't necessarily need a defensive option. But if you need a defensive option, then you could take the slot of Silverwolf or any other character you have in that slot and put that defensive option there. Or when another character comes out that is able to boost the speed even more, that is able to buff the weakness break of the allies, or maybe buff the damage over time effects from the allies and maybe shred the defenses of the enemies as well, then you can probably use that character, but we're entering a danger zone here with how I'm speaking. But overall, I'm really excited for this Kafka dot team, and I think this team has a lot of potential to compete with the Seal Hypercarry team in the future. But only time will tell if what I'm saying is actually true or holds any fruition. But I think a character like Kafka being more self-sufficient is a good thing. Her being a team enabler was a good thing as well, but I think she still is just a really good character overall. Just part of me is a little jaded that they took the damage over time effect increase in her kit and added it to her Eidolons, which makes me a little nervous for the future of the game. Now I do believe that Kafka will probably have the highest selling banner. The reason why I say that is because she reminds me a lot of Raiden Shogun's release. A lot of hype for one character. I haven't really seen this much hype for a character in a very long time. Lastly, I think Kafka will be a very flexible character in the light cones you can put on her. Also very flexible to team compositions you find yourself using with her. And there's a lot of characters you can use with the character as well. You don't have to use Silverwolf, you can use a character like Pela, and the defense that Pela provides is still pretty good. It might be even better in some situations because it's AoE instead of single target. But that's something for a different video. Twitch.tv/Toashield, the link will be in the description. Let me know what you actually found most exciting from the patch reveal. Honestly, I was excited for the reveal of Kafka, of course. The free 10 pull we get for free is pretty nice. There was double relic drop, which I kind of skimmed past, but let's be honest, you're probably going to continue getting garbage relics like me. So I'm not really excited about that. But the continuation of the main story is also really exciting because I actually enjoy the story of Honkai Star Rail so far, believe it or not. Thank you for watching, and have a nice rest of your weekend. Peace.